Now, Franklin Roosevelt said as he was coming into the presidency in the middle of the Depression, he said to the American people something that was very useful, very proper. We have nothing as much to fear as fear itself. Fear of this horrible thing which is descending upon us is the thing we have to fear the most. We have to laugh at this depression and say we're going to lick it. We have to laugh at this crisis and say we're going to overcome it. And if we will take the attitude of having fun in confronting this devil now before us, we'll enjoy the process and we'll win. If we don't have fun, if we go to the school books, if we go to the press and say, well, I got to learn what this is all about. I've got to go to school and study the textbooks. I've got to see the professors. Well, I say, don't bother going to these economics professors. They're the one that created this mess. What do you want to go to them for? I mean, you don't get rid of syphilis by going back to the prostitute that gave it to you. So therefore, let's have some fun. Let's take first the history of the United States economy and the world economy since about the time of the death of Roosevelt. Before Roosevelt died, during the years 1942, 1945, as president, he repeatedly told people, including one famous confrontation with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. He said, "Winston," and Winston was nervous. He knew something was coming. "We are not going to put up, when this war is ended, with your British 18th century methods. We are not going to put up with your colonial system anymore. When this war is ended, we're going to end colonialization and we're going to build these former colonies into genuine countries, standing on their own feet, and we're going to help them develop. And we are going to eliminate from this planet the rule of the economic affairs among nations by your British 18th century methods, that is, the methods of Adam Smith or free trade." Now, Roosevelt did a number of other things beside resolve on that intention. He also designed, not Keynes, but Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his collaborators, designed what became known as the Bretton Woods system. At Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, the state which I come from, right under Mount Washington, the highest peak in New Hampshire and the coldest place in North America come the depths of any winter. It's only about 6,000 feet high, a little over that, but it's the coldest place in North America. From the Arctic, the winds come sweeping down with nothing in their way, and they hit this obstacle, and it is cold. So that's where I come from. But Roosevelt, underneath the eaves of Mount Washington, at a place called the Bretton Woods, famous for the Bretton Woods Hotel of that period, convened an international conference to set into motion a post-war system that is a financial and monetary system with economic intentions intended to rebuild a shattered, war-torn world, shattered by a depression and war. But then he died, and before his dead body had cooled off, Truman had sold him out. Truman and company had immediately authorized and collaborated with the British in sending in British, Dutch, French, Japanese, and other troops to restore colonial power to areas which had been in the process of freeing themselves during the period of the war. So what came out was not good. Truman was not a good man. He was president, but he was not a good man. We've had a lot of bum presidents, in the United States. It's a good country, but bum presidents. And some dumb voters, too, that go match them. All right. So what happened is we got from 1945 on, we entered into collaboration with the nations of Western Europe and with Japan in short order under MacArthur's occupation, and to some degree with the countries of Central and South America in a system which became known as the Bretton Woods system, the old IMF system. It was a system which was based on fixed exchange rates on a gold reserve denominated system. That progress continued through collaboration, especially with Europe and Japan, and past the death and assassination of John F. Kennedy, with ups and downs and faults all in between, and evils and abuses and whatnot. But nonetheless, under the Bretton Woods system, the condition of life of the average person in these countries improved. The productive powers of labor increased. The standard of living on the average improved. Things were moving up, with all the shortcomings, shortfalls, and errors involved. Then came the middle of the 1960s. 1966, fascism came back to America in the form of the Richard Nixon campaign, which was the 1966-1968 Southern strategy, which is love your fellow Klansmen. That's what it was. So you had a group of New York bankers, Southern Confederate types like the teacher, professor of Henry Kissinger, William Yandell Elliott, one of the Nashville agrarians. These are racists, pure racists, the pure Confederates, pure traitors at heart. And also some of these Southern religious types who don't believe in Christ or in God. They believe in money and they believe in magic. That if the Battle of Armageddon would come tomorrow, they'd get raptured and wouldn't have to pay next month's rent. That's their religion. So this crowd took over. Different assumptions were made. 1971, a new monetary system was put in under Nixon, took down the gold reserve system, set up a floating exchange rate, and the world has been going systematically to hell ever since. So we have two systems over the period 1945 to the present. One system which all its faults worked, and another system which has been a disaster from the onset, from the get-go, as they say, which is the present system. So the problem we have is not a depression, it's not a recession, it's not a system in which there are collapses and recoveries. It's a system from which you do not recover. The only way you recover is to get rid of the system. Think of it like cancer. The way you survive cancer is to get rid of it, not to learn to live with it. Okay? So you had a program that was developed by the New York bankers called the Project 1980s, and this program, which was headed up by Brzezinski, actually ran the Carter administration, and Paul Volcker came in to put the knife in the back of the U.S. economy in 1979. That was another phase. Then came 1989, 1991. The Soviet system disintegrated politically and economically. And what happened is that people took the opportunity of the collapse of the Soviet system, no big rival, no challenge. The British monarchy, which is also the head of state of not only the United Kingdom, but Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and some other countries of less significance, and the United States together, set up what was an intent to create an Anglo-American world empire, which later became known as globalization. The whole thing started with a program in 1989, said we're not going to let Germany reunify. But Vernon Walters, who was then the U.S. ambassador to Germany, advised the Bush people, because it's hard to tell the difference sometimes, that this would be stupid. So they made a slightly different deal. And the policy was, that came down to, keep the Germans down and keep the Russians out. In the case of Russia, as in Africa, they said, loot the joint. Don't let them get up off the ground. Loot them into complete poverty. They'll never get off the ground. And so far, they have not gotten off the ground. Steal their raw materials at bottom prices. Steal their scientists at bottom prices. Loot the joint. We went on to do other things. The Anglo-American Empire looted Africa. Look at George Bush's daddy. Barrick Gold, with private armies committing genocide in Congo to get a hold of that gold and other things that they're stealing out of there through Barrick Gold. It's a Canadian-U.S. operation. The former Prime Minister of Canada is involved in it. The same thing is done in Central and South America. Look in 1988, look at the number of countries which were freestanding, semi-independent at least, republics who thought they were independent, who had some power in 1988. How many of these countries of South and Central America have any independence today, any sovereignty? Mexico is looted by the United States for cheap labor. It depends upon its exports to the United States to survive. It was not allowed to develop internal resources to build up. That's been the trend in the United States' attitude toward Mexico since 1982. Ecuador has been extinct as a nation state since dollarization. Peru has been taken over in a coup, a pro-drug runners coup, backed by the U.S. State Department of the U.S. government. Argentina is being destroyed. Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, Colombia, all being destroyed. So where we had states, nation states, with governments, which you could argue with, deal with, in 1988, virtually Brazil is the only one really left standing today. And Mexico has a political character which keeps it alive as a state, but its economic situation is desperate. Africa, hopeless. So that's the kind of world we created. Now the result of the thing is this. We've had empires in the past which, while rotting out at home, continued to revel in imperial glories because they were able to loot their subjects, like the ancient empires of Mesopotamia, or the ancient Roman Empire, or after the fall of Byzantium, Venice became the imperial maritime power, ruling the Mediterranean and dominating all Europe and adjoining regions. And Venice continued to be that kind of power into modern times. Then the British and the Dutch were modeled by the Venetians on the Venetian model during the course of the 16th century and the 17th and 18th century. And they became maritime powers based on rentier financier interest, monarchies which were essentially bourgeois monarchies, that is, they were based on a rentier financier interest, not a productive interest, which engaged in maritime trade, that is, world maritime trade, such as the slave trade, for example, and used naval power to attempt to conquer and subjugate other nations and keep the system going, just the way Venice had done in its time. The United States and the British monarchy attempted to play that game from 1989 on. They looted the world. Now, the problem of that, as all empires of the past should have taught them that lesson, when you are destroyed, when you depend upon what you are extracting from your victims, your prey, as a predator, when you exhaust your prey on which you depend, you bring yourself down. And that is precisely. Now, that's the system we have. The system is controlled by what is called among the racists, the fascists, the other degenerates of the Supreme Court, stockholder interest or shareholder interest. The United States is not run by the interest of the general welfare. That's our constitutional principle, the general welfare. No government has the moral legitimacy to rule except as it is efficiently committed to promote the general welfare of not only all the living, but their posterity. That's the moral authority of a government, nothing else. Now these guys say, no, that is not allowed. That's what Scalia says, Antonin Scalia, and his sons, whatever they are sons of, I don't know, but his sons. He says that repeatedly. The law of the United States, of the majority of the Supreme Court, is called shareholder interest. It's based on John Locke, whose theories developed the Confederate Constitution and the Confederacy itself. That is what has taken over the United States. That's what the Congress stands for. That's what the present administration stands for, with its looting policies in health care, its looting policies in energy. Shareholder interest instead of the principle upon which the United States was founded, which was the general welfare, the improvement of the condition and productivity of labor of all of our people and their posterity. This was the thing we fought for in European civilization and finally got in one approximation in the 15th century, and then established as a force on this planet through the American Revolution, which was the first modern nation-state republic. So we are now ruled by laws, such as the HMO law, passed by the impetus of Pat Moynihan, a great Democrat, back in 1973, which overturned Hill-Burton, which is killing people all over the United States today. He's a great humanist, you know. Believes that the earth is overcrowded, so let's make everything nice for other people by killing as many as possible. So that was a great change. So we have two aspects. We have a world system which has broken with what used to make us powerful, what used to improve our conditions of life in many countries, to a system which is purely parasitical. How do we used to, I'll get to this a little more later, how do we used to survive? From the founding of this country, we fought for against the British at various points, especially from 1763 on. We fought to maintain the right of the Americans to have their own farming system, their own agricultural system, which is progressive, and their own industries, not to become dependents under a globalized system specified by the British monarchy at that time. That's been taken away. We no longer have our own industries. We have a few left. They say made in USA, but they're made in by cheap labor in some other part of the world. These markets are now collapsing. We've lost that. We used to be a society dependent upon scientific and technological progress and cultural progress. And we were pretty good at it, as nations go. We used to educate our young people for that kind of society. It is not a society where you do the same thing from generation to generation, but where today's generation will produce children who are better educated, who will go into schools, who will have better opportunities for work, and create a better condition of life in the society. That was our way. That's the way, what we believed in up until the middle of the 1960s, up until the Southern strategy. That's what we believed in. That's what the Southerners hated, the Confederates. They hated it. It's what Kissinger hates. It's what his teacher, William Mandel Elliott, hates. What the Nashville agrarians hate. So we changed in several respects. We changed in terms of economy, from a productive economy to a predatory one, to an economy which was the keystone nation of a general economic recovery from depression and war, into a piece of wreckage. A predator who is dying of the hunger created by its exhausting its prey. We destroyed our system of government. We destroyed the mission and the conditions of life, especially the intellectual conditions of life of our own people. So what you're dealing with here is a system which, as a system, dooms us to go deeper and deeper into a pit with no solution. The way you get out of a mess with a bad system is you go into the definitions, the axioms, and the postulates of the system, and you rip out the ones that are false. And instead you put in place assumptions which are appropriate ones. Thus you create a new system. In other words, the system is not the point of production. The system is not individual transactions. The system is not economy. The system lies in the superimposition on the activities of economy the activities of life, of certain assumptions, such as shareholder value, such as free trade, such as globalization, and so forth, such as racism in all its disguises. These assumptions act like axioms. And as long as you either believe in these things or believe that you have to put up with your neighbor's democratic belief in this nonsense, then you are doomed to go down with the system, because the system is self-doomed. We are in a self-doomed system. Now, why are we in a self-doomed system? Why are we so stupid, we American people, that we put up with this nonsense? Well, there's a principle which comes from Rome. It's called vox populi, or popular opinion. Some people call it democracy. The worst form of corruption in the United States today is not fascism, it's democracy. Because democracy, in most people's mind, mean popular opinion. You vote for popular opinion. Popular opinion must control the legislature. Popular opinion must determine our laws. Popular opinion must determine how you behave. That's how we killed. How were we killed by that popular opinion? What did the Romans do? Who were the Romans? Why did they invent this thing? They developed a system under which they distinguished between the two layers of the ruling layer, which they called the senators, and the others they called I populari. Now, I populari from the Latin signifies, in general, predator. In other words, it's just as if you want to set up a city in Washington, for example. You set up a city government in which a bunch of guys calling themselves senators took a bunch of people from the street as gangs, trained gangs, armed gangs, and turned them loose on the street, the way some people are planning to do at the end of this month in Washington in the name of anti-globalization. A fourth generation of international terrorism be turned loose on the streets of Washington, D.C. That is what is called I populari, the predators. So all the honest people are terrified by these killers, these gang killers, and they now submit. And therefore, the question of the rulers is, how do they control I populari? How do they control the predators that they use for the killing? It's called popular opinion, vox populi. For predators, the voice of the predator, the howl of the hyena, vox populi. So, as was stated earlier, this Walter Lippmann on the doctrine of 1922 on public opinion. The trick is to use various devices to, in effect, brainwash the American people into becoming backers or recruiting them to a force of popularity, predators, who will prey on their fellow man and work for the nations preying on other nations in order to maintain the rule of the few at top. It's the oligarchical system. How's it done to us? Well, what the result is this. You get people who call themselves, I have my own opinion. I'm an American. I follow the news. I read the newspapers. I know what's going on. I talk to people. I know what people are thinking. I know important people. I got secrets. You would never guess. I got secrets. And this guy is running around saying, I know everything. He will read the Washington Post, which is like turning your mind into a sewer, and other things. The New York Times, it's different. They have the New York Times is a sewer with spangles. The Boston Globe, which is a branch of the co-project of the Washington Post and the New York Times, and so forth and so on. The mass media in general, the entertainment media worst of all, Hollywood, TV. This is the worst. Mass media, mass events, just as in ancient Rome, mass bodily contact sports, with people going into stadiums and tens and hundreds of thousands, obsessed with the events there, while a bunch of dummies beat the hell out of each other in the stadium. And you cheer like mad and come out of there. That's my hero. That's my role model. A prostitute appears on a film. She's a leading star. That's my role model. I want to look just like her. I want to be just like her. This is an American popular opinion. The result is, as I've said repeatedly, and some people are shocked by it, the typical American, if all the oligarchs were to die, if all the lackeys of the oligarchs were to die, most American people would be like the slaves who put the shackles on their own ankles and hands every morning and every night, even when the masters are no longer there to tell them to do so. They have become the self-imprisoned. They're like a bunch of prisoners. For example, the concentration camps of the Nazis were like that. The Nazi guards generally did not go inside the camps. They used certain prisoners, often from the criminal class, the felon type, the physical felon type. And they would use these guys as hit squads, and they would send them on assignments inside the camps to do the killing. This is the way it was working in the 1930s and on. People like Buchenwald, Dachau, and so forth. That's what was going on. The Nazi guards did not go down to the camp unless they went in with a very special operation, very carefully prepared to defend themselves, to handle a situation with shock methods. And that's the way often politics works in the United States. You think of your neighbor as a rat. You think of members of your own family as rats, because these are the people that are going to gang up on you, like the special squads among the prisoners inside the concentration camp, to kill you or ruin you in some other way if you get out of line. So we become a self-policed prison house in the same way that the Roman rulers used e populari and popular opinion to turn the Roman population into a self-destructive force, which resulted in one of the greatest dark ages in known civilization. Not as a result of the rulers, not as a result of Nero or Caligula or even Diocletian. The destruction occurred because of the Roman people themselves. And the destruction which occurs in European civilization since, whether in Europe or the United States or Central and South America, is romanticism. Romanticism means specifically this kind of opinion. The tradition of culture, the condition of artistic taste, the tradition of ideas, the tradition of social relations, adapted from the Roman Empire. For example, the first modern fascist was Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte was created by a mob run from London of the type that they planned to put on the streets of Washington, D.C. from the environs the end of this month. They were called the Jacobin Terror, which was launched on July 14th, 1789, which the French celebrate as a holiday. A fascist coup is celebrated as the official holiday of France, national holiday. They remained in power until Robespierre was beheaded 5 years later. Then France was so destroyed morally from within by this process that a fascist came to power. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. He declared himself Caesar, crowned himself the Emperor Caesar of France, imposed on France a legal code called the Code Napoleon, which is derived from the Latin code, Roman code. And then after that, you had the Restoration monarchy in France, which was a British puppet monarchy. Then you had Napoleon III, who was a fascist. Then you had models like that, such as Hitler, Mussolini, Hitler in this century, and Franco and so forth. This is an example. Modern fascism is a logical outgrowth of Romanticism. of the type that dominates much of the culture of the United States today. So that's the system. That's what makes us prisoners.